So we'll probably talk for longer than we usually have in our service for a sermon. So I'm going to probably edit it down a bit. But yeah. So all right.
Okay.
Well, let me introduce you.
Okay.
My friend Robin is quietly one of the most interesting people that I've ever met. She is a former child actor who played JB on Disney Channel's famous Jet Jackson. She is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and she is currently enrolled in it as a master's level student of clinical mental health counseling at the College of St. Rose. I am pleased to introduce to you Robin Dowell Baum. Hi,
Hello.
Robin.
Hey.
Thank you for
Um,
being with us today and
you're
sharing your story.
welcome. I'm humbled by your introduction.
Well, you are you are someone I consider a very close friend.
Likewise.
Glad to have you in my life. So, I thought we'd start with just a quick question about what does it mean to be trans for folks who don't really know someone in their life, don't have someone who is out trans in their life, or have not really understood it. What's the simplest way to explain?
Well, I think the first thing to know is that trans is an umbrella term. It covers a lot of different kinds of people who identify in a lot of different ways. The broadest definition of trans is anyone whose gender identity does not match the sex they were assigned at birth.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a difference between sex and gender. It's fuzzy, but it's there. Typically, we refer to biology as sex. Everything from genitalia to secondary sex characteristics to chromosomes to hormones, and then gender is a little more subtle. It's sort of the social roles, the mannerisms, the ways of moving through the world, the ways that we sort of communicate with one another in nonverbal ways, right? The way we talk, the way we walk, the way we sit. And traditionally in the West, it's not true for all cultures, but traditionally in the West, someone with a female sex has been assigned the feminine gender, girl and then woman, and somebody with a male sex has been assigned boy and man. We could go into the weeds and talk about how even sex is not binary. There are lots of people, and it's actually surprisingly common. You very well may know someone who was born with sort of ambiguous sex characteristics or genitalia, but who presents binarily because it's just easier.
Yeah, thank you. That's very clear and concise.
Thanks.
So would you mind sharing with us what it was like for you to wrestle with what your gender identity is and to come to terms with it?
Yeah. So I want to preface that story by also saying that for a long time, especially when trans medical care and mental health care was primarily led by, controlled by, gate kept by cisgender, which is the opposite of transgender, right? Somebody whose gender identity matches the sex they were assigned at birth.
It says boy on your birth certificate, and you still identify as someone.
Exactly. That's
as a
this.
female.
And so for a long time, because trans people, certainly out trans people, were marginalized, still true to a great degree, and impoverished. There were no trans doctors, right? There were no trans psychiatrists or therapists. And so access to trans medical and mental health care was gatekept by cis people who really tried to sort of set a standard for what a true, back then it was called transsexual person was, right? So there
Yeah.
was one narrative of transsexualism. And that narrative is, from a very young age, from the time you're like 4 or 5, that you are trapped in the wrong body, trapped in the opposite sex's body. Again, very sort of binary conception of sex, and that you very well may harm yourself or end your life if you are not allowed to medically or surgically transition, right? And that was the one transsexual narrative, and everybody whose story doesn't fit that or didn't fit that were denied access to everything from mental health specialists in trans health, to hormone replacement therapy, to gender affirmation surgeries. All of that was denied to people who didn't fit that sort of pure transsexual narrative. All of that is to say, the reason why I prefaced my story with that is my story doesn't entirely fit that narrative. And because that still continues to be the dominant trans narrative, sort of told by the media and the popular culture, I wasn't able to say I'm trans until I was 35, 36. So I can get into specifics now. I knew from a very young age, probably from around 4 or 5, that I was not a boy. I was assigned male at birth because I had, male genitalia. I did not have, so an element of gender dysphoria, which is a sort of broad range of mental health and emotional negative reactions to the experience of being trans, right? One element of gender dysphoria is what's called body dysmorphia, which is this intense idea that there is something wrong with my body. It's not only trans people who experience this, but there's a specific kind of body dysmorphia associated with gender dysphoria, which is this sort of, I am trapped in the wrong body. My body should not look like this. There was some sort of mistake, and it needs to be changed. That wasn't my experience. I never had strong feelings of, hostility or hatred of my body as a kid. I was just really, really troubled by the fact that people saw my body and said, you therefore belong with this group, with the boys. Because it seemed so patently obvious to me that if you're gonna arbitrarily divide the world up into two types of people, boys and girls, I'm a girl. I talk like a girl. I move like a girl. I like doing what the girls do. I didn't necessarily dislike boys. It was just very clear to me that that was not the category I was in. But again, because, at that point I didn't know the word transgender. But when I did become old enough to become aware of trans folk, the narrative I heard was, trans means, from a very young age that you're in the wrong body and you need to get out of it, right? And that doesn't fit me. So I basically I forgot about, or tried to forget about it when I could. There were various times in my life when it cropped up, where I couldn't not think about it. Times like when I was going through puberty, which was a really traumatic experience for me, as it is for a lot of trans folks, because that's sort of this turning point at which it's a lot harder to deny, right, to the world that you are the sex you're assigned at birth, right? And so that was a really troubling, disturbing time for me. When, late high school, early college, when I started trying to date, was a very hard time for me. Another thing that we didn't say in the sort of Trans 101 piece is that gender and sexual orientation are different. They're different things,
Yeah.
right? It's simplistic, but a way that people talk about it is sexual orientation is who you go to bed with, and gender is who you go to bed as.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But part of what was confusing, from pretty early on, from like middle school, the people I was primarily attracted to were queer women, lesbian and bisexual women. And
Yeah, okay.
and at that point in one's life, all queer people are, dealing with, how do you come to terms with this? What does this mean? How do I articulate my sexual identity? And so dating was really, really hard for me, not only because, a lot of queer women didn't want to date people whose body was like mine. But also just because like I absorbed from the popular culture that like, well, you're the man, so you have to take this role in dating. And it just felt so
Felt like the wrong role.
And
Yeah.
so that was a point in my life where it really cropped up. And I started to have conversations about it for the first time in my life in college with a very few close friends. The person who's currently my spouse was one of them, about like just not knowing what to do with the man label.
Yeah.
And I'm trying not to make this too long a story.
Yeah. That's
But
okay. We have the power of editing. We can shorten
good.
it somehow that way.
um you know uh it was seminary when I actually had my first transgender friends, and that was um another turning point for me. I was around a lot of gay people. I was a theater kid, and a acting kid, so I knew a lot of gay
Right.
people. But I hadn't really met or befriended any trans people until seminary. I went to Pacific School of Religion, which is very progressive UCC seminary, and we had, not a ton, but a handful of trans students.
Yeah.
And so a couple of them I had some intense long conversations with about gender, and that was the first time that I said to myself, that was the first time I learned the word genderqueer, for one. I remember Dr. Megan Rohr, who has just been elected a bishop in the ELCA.
Yeah.
But Megan, the first trans bishop in the ELCA, and Megan came to gave a talk at PSR. And Megan, I'm not sure if they have at this point, but at that point, Megan had not surgically or medically transitioned and was open about that. So the idea that you can be trans and not be a quote unquote transsexual, that was the first time I encountered that idea, right? And so that was the first time, seminary was the first time that I said to myself, you're genderqueer, you're non-binary, you're not a man.
Right.
So that was the first time that my ideas and concepts started expanding around gender. And then Molly, my spouse, and I, who also ended up going to a sister seminary of mine in the Bay Area, we had been having this ongoing conversation about sexuality and gender since college. That's where we met. And so she knew before we talked with my pastor about it, who was a queer Black woman, before we got married, about the fact that like Molly identifies her sexual orientation as queer, as bisexual, and I am not a man. and but I wasn't out about it. No one knew at that point. You know, fast forward, what, 7 years ish, 8 years? Well, probably more like 10 years. We had a child who ended up being very gender expansive. And that was the turning point for me as I wrestled. There were other things that I had started talking to other queer people in the UCC, trans people in the UCC, mostly trans masculine people, as it turned out, because they're easier to find in ministry, trans masculine people rather than trans feminine people. But they were really encouraging of me about sort of coming out at my own pace, you know, in the spaces that felt safe to me. And then meanwhile, you know, my kid was clearly gender expansive. And so I spent a lot of time wrestling with what does it mean for me to be the parent that my child needs. And something that I used to say as a pastor, to parents of young children in the church is, I believe that we can only communicate to our children their unconditional belovedness to the degree that we really believe that about ourselves. That even if we don't talk about it, if we don't love ourselves, I believe that that is communicated, that belovedness is conditional. And so I sort of had this terrifying moment where I realized that what it meant for me to be the parent that my children needed. I had two by that point, even though, you know, one seems to be pretty darn cis. Still, I realized I need to learn how to love myself in my authentic gender. I need to learn to present as my authentic gender, and love myself in it. And that led to my decision to come out and transition eventually.
I have to imagine that that it must have been tempting to just kind of keep it all inside and just, like, you know, say, I know this about myself and there's no reason to be out about it. And so it's interesting to hear.
Yeah. I mean, it's as we may get into a little, like the reason I didn't for 35 years, just beyond having trouble articulating it, but the reason why I didn't for so many years after I knew, after I was out to myself, you might say, was because my worst fear was that what actually ended up happening to me would happen, you know, that I would lose, there would be tremendous loss in my life. But I think eventually one of the things I said to my church when I came out is, I've come to the point where I am more afraid of the world that I helped to create by not being myself than I am of whatever the consequences will be of this. And I think that's still true.
Yeah, wow. It's interesting to hear all the nuance in your story, because I think those of us who are kind of looking from the outside and only know what it's like to be a cisgender person, I think we have this desire to want it to be simplified so that we can understand it, and that's just not the reality. I think your story shows that pretty clearly.
Yeah. And we didn't even get into, since those early days, I eventually decided that I wanted to access gender affirming medical care. And so I did begin a medical transition couple years ago, 2 years ago now, I think. This is healthcare that I would not have had access to in the old transsexual paradigm. And what I've discovered, I've been doing it very, very slowly, sort of taking one small step at a time. And what I've discovered is that sort of each step toward presenting and expressing femininely feels more and more right You know, it feels more and more natural. I feel more and more confident. I feel more and more myself in the world. And that when people meet me, when they look at me, the person they're seeing is actually me. Um, and so that led, you know, when I initially came out, what I said was I'm genderqueer, I'm non-binary, and I'm not, you know, because I don't have intense body dysphoria, you know, I'm not gonna, I don't have plans to change my body. And I subsequently learned actually bodies communicate, right? From very early on, the most painful element of my trans experience was that people read my body and thought man. And I discovered that even when I started dressing differently, right? This was sort of when I met you. I started saying, you know, I'm going to start dressing more femininely, adorning myself more femininely, wearing, you know, earrings and painting my nails and things. And, you know, we'd go to Savannah, you know, the resort where we'd have NGLI, and the staff would, you know, come up to me and be like, "Can I help you, sir?" And I'd be wearing, you know, like a sundress. And I'd be like,
Yeah.
does this look like a sir to you? And
Right.
the
Yeah.
answer, you know, it was heartbreaking for me to find that out. But the answer was yes. That
Yeah.
because my body was what it was, I would always be read as a dude in a dress, as a man in a
Right.
dress.
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I want to be clear that for some trans and non-binary people, their most authentic self is playing with gender in that way. They love it when people
Yeah.
can't quite figure out their gender. They love, you know, what it is to kind of mess with people's conceptions of gender. That wasn't me. That's never been
Yeah.
me. What I want is for what I have always wanted is for people to look at me and see girl.
Yeah.
Um, and so so that, you know, had something to do with my decision to start medically transitioning to access hormone replacement therapy. It's turned out that that actually has had, you know, you feel subtly different when your hormones are different, and
Sure.
I really like the way I feel in
Oh,
general a lot
yeah.
better. There's
Yeah.
an internal experience that also seems to sort of match,
Yeah.
in a subtle way, more closely who I am. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think all of that is just a way of saying, like, yes, it's complicated. Gender is complicated. Sex and sexual identity are complicated. And what I think I want cis folk to know is that, like, it's not up to you to tell people what the real possibilities for their gender and identity and expression are, right? It's
Yeah.
not up to you to say, well, you just think that about your gender, but I know better, right? That
Yeah.
respect is human respect is respecting people's right to self-definition and self-identity, and to be experts on their own experience, right? And so if somebody tells you something about their gender expression or identity that you don't get, it's okay that you don't get it.
Yeah.
But don't assume that they're confused. It's you're confused,
Right.
and that's
Yeah.
okay, you know?
Yeah. I was actually having a conversation about this yesterday, and the closest thing I can personally compare it to is, you know, everyone calls me Topher. My given name is Christopher. And that was
Mm-hmm.
a change that happened around seventh grade where I had two best friends who also were named Christopher. And so I said, well, everyone should call me Topher and it avoids confusion. And so kind of slowly people started calling me Topher more often than they called me Chris.
Mm-hmm.
And I could kind of, it was, you know, it's, I mean, obviously this is not a direct parallel, but that little like feeling of affirmation when somebody took the time to be like, oh, you go by Topher now, like I felt seen. I felt like the person actually knew
That's
me,
exactly it.
you know, and it's
Yeah.
also something that people don't have a problem if you're, you know, your name is Robert on paper and you say please call me Bob. People have no problem with that.
Right.
So,
It's
we should
because
train
I think,
ourselves to make that adjustment.
yeah, and you're right. It's not the same experience, but it's also not that different. So I also want cis people to know that, like, we're not like, our experience of our gender may be confusing to you, and again, that's okay, but we're not alien beings.
Mm-hmm.
We are more the same as human beings than we are
Yeah.
different. And you likely share some parallel experiences
Yeah.
of trying to figure out what it means to be authentically you and communicate that to the world, of feeling seen and not seen, of feeling, times when you have been able to define yourself versus times when people have labeled you and told you what you are. We all humans experience that.
Yeah.
And so much of that just sort of human experience is part of what it is to be trans.
Yeah. And we've been touching on a lot of the other questions I had, but can you tell us a little bit about, because you are an ordained minister in the UCC, same as me, and can you talk a little bit about that call to ministry, and then also what it was like once you were out as a trans person, what it was like to look for a call?
Yeah. So I'll start with the call to ministry. I guess I should say, all of this is tinged with pain. And I can talk about it, and I'm certainly willing to. But I think beyond my own story, something that I would like church folk to know is that among trans people, certainly, and probably queer people, that is the predominant experience of the church. Church is a place that is tinged with pain.
Mm.
And I think there's a lot about minority experience that I may have intellectually sort of grasped a little bit before my transition. But, stuff about what it is to be a woman in the world, what it is to be queer in the world, what it is to be, a minority in the world. It's in a lot of ways, the world is a different place than it used to be. And so I have joined the ranks of the religiously and spiritually wounded and traumatized. And a very significant part of my life right now is working through religious and spiritual trauma. So in terms of call to ministry, I grew up in a non-religious family, sort of not sort of militantly atheist. Like, my parents didn't have a problem with people who believed in God, but they very clearly didn't. My mom was wounded by the Catholic Church and the Catholic school system. She was taught a very sort of punitive God image that wounded her. My dad was raised in this sort of liberal assimilationist post-World War II Reform Judaism. And so he was very clear that he was an atheist. He didn't believe in God, but he very much identified as a Jew culturally. So we didn't do religion. They didn't plan on raising my sister or me with a religion. But I became fascinated by everything religious really, really early on. I would like convene these lunchtime gatherings of my elementary school friends. Like, I get like a Mormon and an evangelical and a Jew and a Muslim, and I just like interview them all about their religion.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Oh my gosh, that's cool.
And by middle school, I decided I was religious, that I wanted religion. But I assumed that I couldn't find what I needed in Western religion, in Christianity or Judaism. I think just by looking at my parents. so I started with a lot of Eastern, there's a Hindu temple not far from where I live. There's a Buddhist temple. I ended up being befriended by a Buddhist nun who maintains a temple near where I live. And so I kind of dabbled religiously all throughout high school, late middle school and high school. Freshman year at college, I was a drama student at New York University. I became friends with this small group in the NYU drama school of practicing Christians, which is, there aren't that many practicing, committed Christians at NYU drama. But these folks they went to church almost every Sunday. They were really committed to their faith. They could articulate to some degree their beliefs, and I just peppered them with questions because I liked them. I was like, how is it that I like you and you're Christian? How is it that like you're a good person yet you're Christian? Because my experiences with Christians had largely not been that, right? Christians were judgmental people who told me that, well, you practice Buddhist meditation, so you better repent or you're going to hell, and it was very clear that that's not, I didn't want that. But these people were awesome. And finally, Molly, again, the person who is now my spouse, finally said, have you ever read a gospel? And I said, no. And she said, well, maybe you should let Jesus speak for himself. So I went to the NYU bookstore and got whatever Bible they were using in Western Civ class, Oxford annotated Bible, and brought it to my dorm room, and I slept on the top bunk and climbed up there with my Bible and randomly opened. I can't remember now if it was Luke or John, but I had this really sort of visceral experience of falling in love with Jesus, being like, that's what I want. That's what I need. If there is something to worship, that which is expressed by that life, that which animates that life, that's what I want. And that was really scary because it's like, oh shit, what does this mean? Sorry, language.
No, you're okay.
Do I have to start like handing out tracts in the subway, or stop believing in evolution, or, suddenly tell my queer friends, I wasn't out queer yet, but I knew, and eventually I discovered the UCC, first Quakerism, and then the UCC, where I learned like, oh no, there's a way that I can be Christian and keep my values, keep my brain, keep my critical thinking. And so I wound up in the UCC and getting ordained. So that's sort of my call story. Or I guess that's my conversion story. Call happened, I think, a little less dramatically or suddenly. But eventually I kind of decided that was part, what it meant for me to follow Jesus was to accompany others in learning what it meant to follow Jesus. So that's the call. The coming out to church. So part of what I was, so we've covered the fact that I sort of had this moment, this come to Jesus moment, where I realized I need to come out as an expression of love for myself and my children and the world, right? And so I was talking to a therapist at the time who did not have specialization. This was in Sioux City, Iowa. So there were no therapists who specialized in transgender mental health. But she was a good listener. She was a good therapist, right? She was a skilled therapist. But she didn't have specialization in trans mental health, and she didn't have a whole lot of experience or adult experience of church. But she did the best she could to encourage me and listen to me and help me sort of plan around how I was going to come out to my church. And what we put together was that I would do. We were getting close to Pride. This was in May. I ended up coming out to my church on Pentecost.
Good,
that I would
theological timing.
Yeah, it was. We decided that I would do a short mini sermon series on queer theology, right? Which is this beautiful theological school, I guess, new theological school coming out of the experiences of LGBTQ people in the Christian church. Over the course of the sort of the late 60s and the birth of the metropolitan community churches, through the present. So I decided that I would do a short sermon series on queer theology, and that at the end of that series, I would tell the church that I am genderqueer, that I'm not cis, and that I intended to socially transition, right? To start expressing my transness in what I wore and how I adorned myself. And another thing that my therapist suggested was that rather than having the first time my parishioners saw me in feminine dress be in person, I should take a picture of what I looked like in feminine dress. And after I came out on Sunday to my congregation, that I should sort of recap and potentially, go a little deeper in a pastoral letter, in a pastoral message, and include a picture of myself closer to the way I intended to continue dressing, so that they could have their initial reaction and feelings to the picture rather than to me, which I think all made a lot of sense. What I was naive about is that I believed the church when it said we are a safe place. I believed the United Church of Christ when it said all are welcome. And so I believed, I knew there would be a reaction. I knew there would be anxiety produced in the system, to use pastory language, by my coming out, right? It's a big thing. Yeah. But I did not know that church was a fundamentally unsafe place for me to come out because I was told otherwise, So again, we're not talking about everybody. Some people were super supportive. Even some people who were really confused were very supportive, right? I had pastored this church for 6 years by the time I came out, so I had 6 years of like loving these people, of, being in their homes and going to their kids' ball games and, sitting by their bedside as they died and as their loved one died, right? So there were several people who were really confused by my gender, who did not initially understand what I was saying at all, but who said, we know you, we love you, and we will love you,
don't get this, but we're willing to go there.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were also people who said, you need to be gone, and I will be doing everything in my power to make sure that happens until you are gone. I had one parishioner said, how am I supposed to bring my mom to church with you dressed like that? There was a lot of sort of like, what will the neighbors think? What will the other churches think? We're going to be the laughing stock of the community with a pastor like this. there was some bullying that happened, sort of some public shaming. Somebody saying, um, the pastor is not, what is this nonsense about, trans and genderqueer and non-binary? The fact is the pastor is just a 30-something-year-old cross-dresser who wants to cross-dress at work, and it's not appropriate. So it was toxic. It became really toxic really quick, because there were people who were so angered by my coming out, and their perception of how it would impact them in their life and their church. They were so angry at me that they started to do things. They started to do whatever they could to hurt me. And so, my pastorate ended really abruptly and painfully. We engaged the conference in trying to help, but the leadership of the church was not willing to really listen to or cooperate with the process that the conference suggested. And my pastorate ended before I got a chance to say goodbye. My pastorate ended in December. It took a few months, but the Sunday after my pastorate ended, church had to be canceled due to a blizzard. And I saw people the following week who did not know. I saw parishioners who did not know I was no longer their pastor. And so it was just really, it was badly done.
Yeah.
The way my pastorate ended. It was bad for me. It was bad for my parishioners. It was just really abrupt and really painful. And then I thought, again, because I had led to believe that the UCC is an open place, I thought, okay, well, I'll get my profile out and I'll find another church.
Yeah.
And what I discovered was that even the most ONA churches who had rainbows on their logos and were, publicly supporting, queer kids and support groups and stuff, they would have been thrilled to have me as a member. There would have been a lot of sort of progressive street cred for having me as a member, but they weren't going to call me as a pastor. And that was
more difficult for them.
Yeah. I had one, I actually have a lot of respect for one. Most churches would sort of interview me and we'd have a really great interview. And then I just sort of get a form letter saying thanks, but no thanks. Every pastor in the UCC knows what that letter is. But one chair of a search committee actually wrote me a long email and said, I want you to know that, and again, this was a super ONA progressive church. But they said, I want you to know that we are so inspired by you and your ministry, more than any candidate we've yet interviewed. We just don't think our church can handle your gender.
Right.
And so I felt like that was an experience again of like I live in a different world now. I see the world from a different vantage point than I used to. And so as a, presenting as a white, cis, married, educated male, I saw the UCC and I thought, this is amazing. This is a super open, progressive, we love everybody kind of church. And I think that is our aspiration, but that is far from the reality. And I saw that the ugliness of that reality in the church in a way that really hurt.
Yeah. I don't presume you to know this, but you can't be inside of their mind. But do you have any idea what the thought process behind that is? Where, the what you're talking about how they would love to have you as a member, but as the pastor, it's a different story.
Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, it's similar. One of the things that I kind of touched on earlier is that in the UCC, we have working trans clergy, which is great. The vast majority of them are trans masculine clergy, right? They're people who were assigned female at birth and now present more masculinely. I think that has a lot to do with plain old misogyny, right? I think
Sure.
in the way that a lot of churches for a long time, even in the UCC and probably still, they love to have women as members.
Yeah.
They need women as members,
Hmm.
but there's something different about a woman being the pastor, right?
Yeah.
Race, I think, is another one, right? Like you
Sure.
talk to Black clergy in the UCC and their experience of search and call, right? Progressive churches especially would love to have Black people as members.
Right. Yeah.
But if you're the face of our church, right? If you're the leader of our church, that's just uncomfortable, because
Yeah.
we have this idea of who a pastor is, and it is still overwhelmingly, a 40-year-old white man.
Yeah. And it's something I would imagine people don't realize that they're having that as a conscious thought. It's just sort of this like unconscious, that's why we have to examine ourselves for racism and bigotry and homophobia and all that, because we don't really realize that we have these biases until we get into a
Yep.
situation that we never expected.
And the tragedy is you simply can't see what you can't see, right? Uh,
Yeah, right.
that's what's tragic is, I'm working through a lot of anger and resentment at people
Yeah,
in the church, and yet I realize that most of these people are not bad people. They're not people of ill will. They're
yeah,
people who just can't see what they can't see.
yeah. I remember too being with you in the midst of this and just being like, why won't anyone hire her? Like, this just doesn't make sense. She's one of the best pastors I know, and any church would be so lucky to have her. And it just from the outside, it feels like craziness, but there's definitely a real anxiety and fear that people are reacting to, I suppose.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well said. And thank you. Um,
Yeah. No, I think about it all the time. It's such a tragedy that you're not out there in the ministry, that you don't have a church to pastor. I don't know. It's like uh, Batman without a Gotham City or something. So
yeah, I mean, one thing that's relevant, I think, is that part of what led to my decision to stop searching was the realization that my experiences of the church had gotten to a point where I held more hurt than affection for the church. And so I got to the point where I said to myself, it would not be healthy for you to pastor a church. Um, there's been a ton in terms of my own faith, my
yeah,
own spirituality and faith life. Like, I am very much rebuilding. It is hard for me to believe what I once believed in the wake of what happened. So I think that's also something, straight church members or cis church members should know about. um, we like to sort of separate the church from the faith, or the church from God, or the church from
yeah,
Jesus. Um, but that separation, like, I guess, to use theological language, it's sacramental, right? The church, for good or for ill, is what God looks like in this material plane.
right. Yeah,
Um, and so, and I know intellectually, right, that's a problematic statement. We could pick it apart. Um,
right.
but the fact is, like, it didn't just end my career. It didn't just cause the loss of my community and my home. It ended my Christian faith as I knew it.
Yeah,
And I still haven't put it all back together.
right. Sure.
And that's devastating, especially for some,
Yeah,
when you're a pastor, your identity
right.
as a Christian,
Yeah, kind of important to us.
Yeah, right. um
Yeah.
and it broke that. um so
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's an element that even I feel, that this impulse toward, like, yeah, I want to have a church.
Right.
But then there's this other piece that, like, you're not, it may not have integrity to call you a Christian right now,
Yeah.
if it ever will again, you know? And that's
Right. I
just
mean,
tragic to me.
yeah, it's heartbreaking. I mean, I can't imagine how you feel because I'm not in your shoes, but I imagine that it would be like a heartbreak, like getting your heart pulled out and thrown on the
Yeah.
floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one apt metaphor for it. Um, yeah, I mean, it's also like, it's so much of how I had built. Well, I guess this isn't unique to pastors. When anybody sort of, when evangelicals talk about their period of theological deconstruction, or Mormons leave the Mormon church, um, so much of my identity, so much of the way that I understood the world and my place in it, I made meaning through that lens, and that lens broke. So it's like, who am I? What is this world? It's existentially terrifying.
Yeah, for sure. So as I predicted, we've been talking for almost an hour.
Yeah.
And I think we've covered the questions that I wanted to ask you. Aside from my last one, I just want to ask you, because I thought your story would be a good one for my community of faith to hear. So, what can an open and affirming UCC church that's in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, learn from your story?
Well, for one, I want to emphasize again, saying that all people are welcome, saying that your church is a safe space for all, when that is not true, is abuse. It is much more humane to say, we're becoming open and affirming, we're
Yeah,
learning, um, we're getting there. um,
right.
because I mean, I think regardless of how open and affirming you get, there's probably a segment of the queer community that will never trust you,
Sure.
um, because the church has just done so much damage for so long.
Yeah,
Um,
it's trauma for a
right.
lot of people.
But there will be, and there are growing, I mean, we're seeing it, right? Growing numbers of queer identified folk are becoming religious, or are becoming
Yeah,
church going, right? Um, and know that, like, a segment of the queer population will believe you, and that responsibility
yeah.
is
That's something you gotta
huge.
continue
um
to live
so,
up
I want to emphasize that. The other piece is just the, like, if someone tells you about their gender and you don't get it, the way to respond is not to try and put it into your terms, or to try and, get them to see that, like, they're really just making life more complicated than it needs to be, or right.
right.
the
Yeah,
the humane response to somebody risking the intensely intimate act of telling you that they are not cisgender, right, is to say, wow, thank you so much for talking to me about this. I
yeah,
will use your pronouns. I will use your name. Um,
right.
I will, what can I do to help you feel seen? Because that's just what love
Right.
is, right?
Yeah,
Love is
yeah,
seeing people, and love is
yeah.
loving people as they are.
Well, thank you so much, Robin. I really appreciate you sharing your story with us and letting us learn from it.
I really appreciate being asked, and I appreciate that the church wants to have this conversation. Um,
Yeah,
and I love you. So that's a
I
big
love you too. Yes.
No.
I miss being able to see him more on a regular basis for sure.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna stop the recording real quick.
Cool.
Oh, let's see. That's how you do it. Okay.
And so